Thank you all the attendees for joining in this great session by Wayne Brockbank. Wayne, rather than delving me into a lot of introduction about Wayne, everyone can Google him and you can understand, but we're just going to have some basic conversation in order to understand his career trajectory. At the same time, will help us understanding as to how we are going to approach this session. So it's a lot of conversation in this session. I would also request all the attendees that if you have got that questions, you have got some insight, you want to share it with Wayne, just raise your hand on the Zoom platform, and I'll bring you on the podium. So on that note, Wayne, I'll start this session. So I'll just do some rapid fire questions. Just answer whatever you feel you're comfortable with. Okay. So yeah. So my first question is that when did you really decide to become a professor? I know it's almost 40 years now, but when did you really decide that this is what I want to do? I want to be an academician.
Well, it's not so much. It's when my wife told me to become a professor. That's partially true. It was a very interesting experience. I had a professor when I did my master's degree at Brigham Young University, who I really deeply respected. He's one of the 2 or 3 smartest people I've ever known in my life. His name was J.B. Ritchie, and he told me once. I was talking to a friend who had been already accepted to MIT's PhD program, and I said, "So why did you go get a PhD?" Because Professor Ritchie said I should. Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'll do that because I was just promoted in a company I was working for in my undergraduate coming out of my master's degree, and then my colleague said, "Well, you'll go get a PhD too." And I said, "Really, what makes you think that?" He says, "Because Professor Ritchie said you're going to." So that's what I did. The other thing is, my wife and I have very strong feelings for the moral and almost ethical responsibility to share with the world any opportunities we've had. And to do that, it seemed to me to become a professor was the way to do that best, to be able to gain knowledge, to integrate it, to develop new knowledge, and then to share that. So that became a fundamental driving desire for us across the world. And as a result, we've lived at least 1 year, a full year, in India, China, Ghana, Nigeria, Germany, the UAE, and the United States. So we've tried to live up to that obligation we've felt to share and to be part of the global community.
Oh, great. So you have been there in this entire ecosystem of human resources and for almost more than 40 years. If I have to ask you to just give me a couple of learnings in terms of the entire audience. So what have been the 2 key learnings or maybe 3 key learnings which you have had in the last 4 decades or something? Now, I know this is going to be very difficult, but just in terms of whatever you feel is just out of the league itself, something like that.
We'll talk more of this when we get into leadership.
Sure.
But it's very clear there are 3 things that have come together in my intellectual journey. One is that early in my career, I had the opportunity of working with an oil company, and this company become very inward focused, and it kind of lost track of a real deep, in-depth feeling for what's going on in its marketplace. Now they thought they did, but when we went out and surveyed the very broad customer base, we found that that the company had in fact lost kind of some of its connection with what the fundamental drivers in the markets were. And as a result, they were hiring the wrong kind of people. They were promoting the wrong kind of people. They were measuring the wrong things. They were rewarding along the wrong criteria. And when we brought that customer data in and helped, by the way, and the company, we weren't doing this as consultants. We had the company actually go out and gather the data. But when we brought that data back and presented it and showed the inconsistencies between their assumptions and what the marketplace actually wanted, and then we redesigned who was going to get promoted, what the measurements were, the rewards were, what the training programs were going to look like, the kind of people were going to be hired. When we realigned all of those fundamental organization HR levers to be consistent with actually what the customer wanted, this company's market share just skyrocketed. And over a 2-year period of time, that change increased its market share about 12%. That brought revenues that increased revenues about $2.6 billion. And so, and I was shocked, as actually the company was too, by what happens when you make sure with absolute certainty that you understand what the customers require, and you ensure that you have the organization in place that are created by the collective HR practices that are consistent with those practices. That's probably the single most important. Now notice that story brings together 3 pieces. One is the importance of connecting HR practices and leadership practices to market realities. That you don't start by saying, what does the company want, or what do employees want, or what do leaders want? You start by saying, what does the market require? And then you make sure that that understanding is facilitated by a flow of information that is accurate, timely, shared, debated, and then utilized. And then third, and all of that builds on a foundation of the concept of culture. Then the question is, what kind of a culture do we need to have that's consistent with the requirements of the marketplace, that is informed by the flow of information that comes from the marketplace into the firm? So customer knowledge, information, and connecting all of that to the culture that you need to have. So
Good.
that's my fundamental learning, and I've been working on that for the last 40 years.
Great. I think a lot of insights in that. We'll continue with that in our further discussions. There's another thing which I want to know now. Since you have written a lot of research papers, you've written a lot of books, published a lot of articles, there's a lot of content which have really come from your side. I've got a very simple question, and this is related to books, really. I have gone through almost all your books which you have written, which you have co-authored, which you authored. That when is the time when you decide that I have to write a book? So is it about a topic which excites you? It's about sudden market reality which is there? When do you really think that I have to go about sharing some knowledge to the world?
That's a great question. Boy, these are not the questions you sent me, but these are terrific.
There's some surprises. It's always good to have some surprises, right?
Well, these are terrific questions. Okay, so how do I decide when to write a book? In my heart of heart, I'm an empiricist. That is, I'm a little bit creative, but the main thing that I am is I'm an empiricist. I believe in data and research. But what informs my research is something very clear. That is, I'm looking for the organization, leadership, and HR practices that have greatest impact on business performance. But now that's part of the equation. That's only half the equation. The other half of the equation of what leadership, organization, and HR practices tend not to be done well. Okay? So what I do is try to put those together. So the point is that if those practices have great impact on business performance, but everybody's already doing it, then I'm not going to write a book about it because everybody's doing it. And a lot of times companies and students, executives that come to our programs kind of want to be I need to be careful, I don't want to say this too much, like to be patted on the back and say you're doing really well. And that's okay, but if everybody else is doing the same thing really well, then that's not competitive advantage. That's not bringing competitive advantage to the marketplace.
Right.
On the other hand, if something isn't done well, but doesn't create any value, then that's stupid. You don't want to focus on things that aren't done well, that don't add any value. But what you do want to focus on is those practices that add great value, but tend not to be done well throughout the world. Because that's the area of opportunity. That's the area of potential competitive advantage. Things that are important, but companies tend not to do. Every 5 years at the University of Michigan, we do a major study of HR, organization, and leadership practices. And then we analyze those in terms of that model. And by the way, that data set is huge. We now are approximating 100,000 people in that data set. And not only do we have the largest data set that's been continuously done over almost 35 years, but it's huge. It's a huge data set. It has over 100,000 people in the data set now. But it's also the largest database in India. There's some very interesting findings out of India, which we have time. If we have time, we can explore some of those. And so every 5 years, we survey the world, and we ask lots and lots of questions. The survey, it's frustrating because it's too long, but we're trying to explore all the possibilities. And what we're looking for is what are the practices that have greatest impact on business performance. We're not asking what practices do people like, or what practices do result in leaders or employees being happy. We ask what are the practices that impact business results, that impact market share, that impact market capitalization. We're asking business results. And then we ask, once we identify those, and we say, so which of these are not being done very well today? And that's how we identify what book needs to be written.
Great. That's a terrific process to go. Now I'll really come to the webinar, which we have, I think, a lot of information you have shared now. So to all the attendees, the topic for the webinar is how leadership will adopt in post-COVID times. We will be talking about different concepts which are affecting or which are going to affect leadership in this phase of getting unlocked and going back to the system. And also when a lot of majority of people will be working out of home, there will be a lot of fear of employees coming back to the organization, and there would be a lot of mismatch. There's some people are working from the organization, some people are working from their homes. So how will leadership really adapt? We are going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how we'll bring in sustainability through leadership to drive continuous results. When my first question about this topic is, which I want you to throw some light on, is so what has really changed? Like if we have to do a simple difference between leadership 3 months in, let's say, in March 2020 and let's say leadership in June 2020, how can we differentiate? So what, according to you, what has got this much different in terms of leadership?
I think that's a great question, and I love this question. At one level, as an organization, this COVID-19 business has created huge amounts of pain and suffering throughout the world. About two months ago, one of my best friends passed away from the COVID-19. Big tragedy for his family, for his friends. So this has been a great tragedy. From an organization theory perspective and from a leadership perspective, this has been a fascinating time. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let me give you a quick vignette that I shared actually with one of your Indian colleagues a couple of days ago.
Sure.
Last January, my daughter and I ran the Walt Disney half marathon at Disney World. I flew in from Abu Dhabi, where I was working, and we arrived late at one of the Disney hotels. It was after midnight, So I asked the desk clerk, who happened to be, interestingly enough, from India. So I asked him, how do you like your job? Now, the lobby was empty because it was after midnight. So I asked him, how do you like your job? He said, I love my job. I said, but you're working the graveyard shift. Why do you love your job? He says, I love my job because I don't have a boss.
Okay.
Oh, but I'm the only person here. And I get my work done. I'm efficient. I can look at my own work. I hold myself accountable. And that's why I love my job. Anyway, now let's take that into the COVID situation.
Right.
So what's happened during COVID-19? A good portion of the world's workforce now has been working from home for a period of time. This webinar we're having now today might have been held in a hotel in Bangalore somewhere,
okay.
and we'd have the session there. But now we're doing it here virtually, and what that has forced is this being physically separated, and not having bosses directly overseeing everything that's going on, has forced bosses to trust their employees. So that's and leaders have been forced to adopt the leadership trust paradigm, not because it's instinctive to them, but because it's mandated, because they're not face to face with their employees anymore.
Right.
I'm familiar with. I wish we had more research on it right now, but we don't.
Yeah.
Right now, but I know of two large surveys and 2 company surveys that have been conducted during the last 3 or 4 months, and each one of those surveys have provided fascinating results, and that is during this time period where people have been isolated at home, there have been 3 or 4 basic findings across that research. One is people feel more trusted. Well, they not only feel more trusted, their leaders have to trust them more because they don't have any alternative.
Right. Correct.
Second, people in the context of being trusted, they feel more productive. They see decisions being made faster. And interestingly enough, they see themselves even collaborating better. These are surprising results. So people are either along those dimensions of collaboration, productivity, speed of decision making, and trust. Those people have said in all 4 of those surveys that they think that things are either the same or better than they were than in the past. Okay, so the first paradigm shift is trust, not because they read. I love Steve Covey and whatnot. Not because they read a leadership guru, or because they think that trust is really important. Because they have to trust. They have no alternative. And what they're finding then is when they've trusted their people, it's unleashed human creativity. It's unleashed productivity. It's even unleashed greater collaboration and trust with each other. So trust is one major paradigm shift. Another paradigm shift is, we've been talking about flexible organization and adaptable organization and agile organization forever.
Right.
And actually, our Indian colleague C.K. Prahalad, back in about 2000, 2001, was the one that really pushed agility as a dominant leadership and organizational paradigm.
Right.
And the reason, so leaders are having to create organizations that are more agile. And the reason is they had no option. COVID-19 hit. They had to be agile or they're going to go broke.
Correct.
So they had to figure out, how are we going to do things differently? And one of the aspects of agility that relates back to trust is that in the process of being isolated, they were free of bureaucratic controls, and people had to figure out how to do their work best without being supervised either by a boss or by a set of rules procedures. Because the rules that were applicable in January, a lot of the rules that were applicable in January simply were not applicable 4 months later.
Absolutely.
And so agility became important, but it became facilitated. By a reduction in bureaucratic oversight. HUL had been working on bureaucracy. You know HUL, of course.
Yes.
Has been working on reducing bureaucratic infrastructures for many, many years. So when COVID-19 hit, they were probably as ready as any company in the world. That is not just HUL, but Unilever as a whole.
Yes.
To cope with the COVID situation, because they'd been working at getting people to feel empowered, getting people to feel that they make decisions on their own without having a lot of bureaucratic oversight and infrastructure. So agility, but now agility, we've been talking about it, but now throughout the world, agility as a leadership paradigm has been forced on people. And the last paradigm that has happened is the flow of information, that people simply had to be able to gather information from the marketplace, prioritize it, analyze it, share it, utilize it, debate it differently now than they have ever before in the future. So recognizing the importance of information. The other thing, if I could for just a minute while we're on that mention, we have found that in our research on HR, now this is HR and leadership practices, that HR professionals that are involved in the orchestration of information have and have that as a dominant agenda within their HR department, create greater value for customers and shareholders than anything else they can do. It has, when HR becomes involved in helping to orchestrate the flow of information, then that has more influence than measurement, rewards, staffing, promotions. For example, when HR folks get involved in that flow of information, that has twice the impact on HR's value in creating value for customers, twice as much than anything else happens in HR. But consistent with our research, they don't do that very well. But so think about it this way. We found that there's 3 segments to the flow of information. The first step is you have to access the right information, then you have to analyze it accurately, you have to debate it, you have to share it, and then you have to utilize it. And if any one of those steps goes to 0, then the whole equation goes to 0. And why that's important is, McKinsey and other leading consulting firms, lots of consultants say, well, the critical issue is getting the right information. And our research says that's only the beginning. Once you've got the information, if you don't prioritize it, then that information is irrelevant. If you've got it and you prioritize it, but you don't debate it and find out what the meaning is within that information, then it's useless. And if you get it, you prioritize it, you debate it and analyze it, but you don't utilize it, it's still 0. So all of that has to be seen as an integrated whole. The question is, who's responsible for making sure that integration occurs? Now, if you think that one of the primary responsibilities of leaders and HR professionals is to create an organization that wins, to create the organization capabilities that can beat the competition. That's what brings together leadership and HR, is organizational capability. Now, in today's world, information is clearly a source of competitive advantage, and HR and companies that create that kind of capability will win, and those that don't will not win. And in COVID-19, we've had to think about different ways of accessing, analyzing, prioritizing, and debating information we've never had before. Let me give you one final example.
Sure.
Several years, as part of our I've been in the last 4 years, I've talked to about 29, 31 different companies in the financial sector, high-tech sector, defense sector, and fast-moving consumer goods sector. And what I've found is that those are all a multiplicative relationship. As I indicated, if any one portion of that model goes to zero, the whole thing goes to zero. In the process of doing that research, I came across an executive who's now a very senior executive in a very well-known company. I won't reveal his name or the company's name.
Sure.
But he's now a senior executive. 20 years ago, when he was kind of a junior executive, he made a brilliant decision that made his company a huge amount of money. Okay. At that time, his company could give spot bonuses. So his boss called him in and said, that was a brilliant decision you made. You gathered the right information, you made the right decision, and your analysis was absolutely brilliant. Here's your spot bonus, $10,000. The guy said, "Oh, that's terrific. Thank you very much." And then he got up to walk out, and his boss said, "By the way, who did you share who did you share that experience with?" He said, "Well, I didn't share it with anybody." He said, "Come on, sit back down. Could I see your check again?" And he said, "Yeah." He handed him the check, and his boss ripped it up in front of his face. And he said, your job, if you're going to be a senior executive in this company, your job is not to be smart. Your job is to make my company smart." Okay, that's the power of it. And he says he's never forgotten that. And so every time he has the opportunity to access, analyze, he makes sure that information is shared, and he makes sure that anybody that reports to him is constantly making the information whole greater than the sum of the parts.
Right.
Okay. I think that's a great story, by the way. That's one of my favorite stories of late.
Absolutely. I think it's more about not just managing yourself in these times, but also managing other people is something which is very critical. And as you just mentioned, that passing on the knowledge is something which is very, very essential for any organization to really build and become more sustainable. Right?
Now, and you're absolutely right. So is that a technical issue? Is it a cultural issue? Mm-hmm. That's a cultural issue.
Right.
And that's where leaders and HR have to work together to make sure that the culture in place that leverages information for the sake of agility that then facilitates trust.
Sure.
At least I think.
Yeah.
That's my...
Great. So when you mentioned a lot about information as a concept in terms of getting the information, prioritizing the information, processing the information, there are 2 to 3 more things which really encompasses leadership. So I just want to understand from your end, if you can share some insights as to, so trust is something which is very important, which you have mentioned. It's indispensable. You have to have that trust on your folks. And if you don't trust, then you have not hired the right people, maybe. But how do you think has empathy, compassion, and AI, which is emotional intelligence, evolved in the last 3 months? Because what was happening in 3 months back is that you have got 100 of people on your floor. You can directly go to anyone, you can see anyone, right? But suddenly there is no one, there's no floor. There is no floor at all. And it's all laptops, and it's all Zoom call, Microsoft Teams, where you can still have that meeting, but that physical proximity is absolutely nil. So how does these concept of compassion, empathy, and emotional intelligence now come into the picture? If you can share some insights.
Yeah. The companies that I've seen that have handled this situation best have had 2 characteristics as a foundation. One is they didn't create a culture of empathy and trust out of a vacuum. They've been working on that for years and years. And we've seen that throughout, by the way, in many companies in India, throughout the Tata companies, through Emphasis, through HUL, through Mahindra. It just, list goes on and on. So that foundation. Second is as this situation has evolved, then they acted with a great deal of sensitivity to the people that were being impacted by it, and they had to provide a feeling of stability that gave people confidence that leaders knew what they were doing, and that they were acting in the best interest of the employees. I'm a great believer, a passionate believer, that the driving force in business has to be the customer.
Correct.
Because if you have happy employees that aren't happy making customers happy, then you've got the wrong employees. You suggested that earlier in our discussion, right? So what you want to make sure is you've got employees that are happy making customers happy. That's the key issue, and that is built up over time. Now, so how does empathy fit into this? The leaders that have handled this well, that I've seen, have recognized that as customer focused, customer centric as they are, they had to kind of shift their attention to stabilize the workforce, to give the workforce the confidence that the company was going to be okay, that it was going to succeed, that we would get through this. That is, we would get through this together. And they created that sense of teamwork. But at the same time, as vestiges of bureaucracy, of control, tried to insert control where control was A, counterproductive, and B, impossible, then it became an issue. Do we want to do, as we come out of COVID-19, do we want to continue to elicit trust, to continue to have empathy for people, to help them to feel empowered, focused, self-regulating, or are we going to put them back into a bureaucratic control structure, which is how things have functioned for the last decades? And this is an inflection point for many companies. And the companies that are able to continue the trust and empathy, I think, are going to be way ahead of others. One example of empathy, I think sometimes we tend to underestimate empathy. Years ago, Bob O'Neill, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, I believe, in the U.S. government, was hired by, when there was a change in the presidency, he became the CEO at Alcoa. And he said, so what's going to be your major message to the Alcoa workforce and to its shareholders and to its customers? He said, safety. Oh, you know what happened to Alcoa's market share over the next 9 months? It dropped like a rock. You mean we've got a softy here that's going to be concerned about safety instead of market share and profits and growth and performance and productivity? Instead, he's talking about safety, and its market capitalization just dropped. Then, over a period of time, people asked him why. The employees had asked him why. He said, because my first obligation is to bring you from your families in the morning, have you work hard, and to have you return to your families in the evening with your hands, your eyes, your fingers, and your emotions intact, so that you can be back in a healthy family. For a long time, they did it. Talk. They just didn't. This is just another CEO trying to kiss up to us. And then an event happened where the most productive plant manager had an accident, and he didn't report it. It wasn't a big accident, but it was a minor accident, but it's one that should have been reported. And he didn't, and he's this most effective plant manager, and he didn't report this breach of safety violations. So now it's only a minor breach, didn't have any overall big impact. But now what do you do as the CEO that's been talking about safety? And now your most important, most productive plant manager has made a slight error on safety. O'Neill thought about it for about an hour and called him in and fired him. At that point, now notice what he's doing. He's having total empathy for the workforce. At that point, the workforce said, boy, this guy is really walking his talk. We will throw our efforts behind him. And over the next 2 or 3 years, market share grew, market capitalization grew, profitability grew. So empathy is not just this warm fuzzy thing that a lot of consultants talk about. It can be a core competitive advantage. Now, that's part of the empathy scenario. That's internal empathy. But over time, there has to be also a mutual empathy between the customers and the employees, right? Another form of empathy, do the employees have empathy for the customers? Now, why that's important is sometimes companies forget that the only reason that they exist, the only reason companies exist is to meet the requirements of the marketplace, right? As soon as companies stop meeting the purpose for which society brings them into existence, then society will put them out of business.
Correct.
So the question is, how do you create and sustain empathy for the customer? So empathy just isn't from leaders to employees, but also from employees to customers. Do the customers feel and have compassion, and do they have an emotional connection out to their customers?
Right. Great.
I hope that makes sense. Let me give you an example.
Sure.
You know, about several years ago, bought JLR. JLR's been in trouble. Jaguar Land Rover.
Yes.
But in its history, Jaguar Land Rover has had some marvelous success stories. Years ago, they had a CEO, John Egan, and at that time, when Egan took over, Jaguar was rated number 32 out of 34 in the J.D. Powers Quality Survey. They were right at the bottom. And Egan came in, and it was a disaster. So he said, I need to understand what's going on. So he had audio recordings made of customer interviews, several dozen. And so he would listen to those audio recordings and of these customers who were really, really angry. Think about, several years ago, Jaguar, if you could own a Jaguar, that was the most luxurious, sexy car you could ever have. And people loved the brand, but they saw Jaguar, the workforce and leadership destroying the brand that they loved. So they had all these audio tapes made of customers who were generally really, really angry. So he listened to these audio tapes on his way home. Then he'd go into his house at the end of the day. He'd slam, because by the time he's listening to all these things, he's really angry. He'd slam the door, yell at his kids, and go upstairs without dinner because he was so angry. And after a few weeks of this, he said, I'm angry. And then he looked around the boardroom one day, the senior management boardroom, and he said, look, I'm the only one that's angry around here. Now notice what's happening. He's becoming empathetic with the customers. He's starting to feel in his heart what the customers are feeling. So now he looked around his boardroom one day and said, look, I'm the only one that's angry. So he had several dozen copies made of these audio recordings, and he made his management team listen to these. So he's got a couple of dozen people going home after listening to these tapes, slamming the door, yelling at the kids, kicking the dog, and going upstairs without dinner. It wasn't, and one day after a couple of weeks of this, they looked around and said, now notice what he's doing. He's creating empathy in his leadership team with the customer. Then he had hundreds of these videotapes, these audio tapes made, and were distributed throughout the workforce. And now he had several, hundreds of people that work for JLR listening to the customer, developing this deep empathy, and going home, kicking the dog, slamming the door, kicking the dog, yelling at the kids, and going upstairs without dinner. It wasn't great for family life in central England, but that was the foundation of a radical turnaround. Because people said, we can't, if we don't have greater empathy and translate that empathy with our customer into what we do on the inside, then we're going to die. For the next 8 years, Jaguar went from number 32 to number 8 in overall quality. So you have internal empathy, as I talked about in the Bob O'Neill story, but also there has to be a connection of empathy between the customers and the employees.
Sure.
Make sense?
Yes, absolutely. The JLR story is definitely a lot of connection can be built on this thing. Great. The next question is something which is more like a comparison. I'll just give a comparison. So whenever we are in crisis, so right now the world, not just COVID, we have got a lot of environmental crisis, and so whenever there's a crisis, we come out with a set of guidelines and a set of to-do lists which we have to do. So if you ever heard of sustainable development goals, which has got 17 different criteria on which we have to improve. Now my next question is that if we have to create that sustainable leadership goals or sustainable leadership method, what are the pillars which you think should really be there in terms of making leadership really sustainable in these times? Because you have to drive the results continuously, because if you don't, your organization is getting into a lot of trouble. So you have to manage a lot more things compared to how you were doing 4 months from now. So what are those pillars to make leadership sustainable?
I think that's a great question, and every I've talked to several dozen leaders over the last few months, and almost everyone is grappling with that issue.
Right.
So let me address what I think I've picked out as the common themes.
Sure.
For the folks that I consider to be the most effective leaders. And here they are. Number one is they have to be able to, now again the question is, if you're going to have sustainable results in the midst of this crisis, what do leaders need to do?
Yes.
We already talked about one thing. They need to be able to convey a sense of stability and optimism.
Okay.
That we'll get through this together. We'll be okay. We'll get through this, and they have to act in a way to do that. If companies have waited around to see what everybody else is doing and then responded, I'm not very optimistic about their future, because they're not conveying confidence and stability in the midst of this change. The companies that have done it well have gotten out in front, have created virtual platforms with working rules, have enabled people to be trusted and have moved forward. So maintaining that sense of stable confidence, I think it has to be a foundation in this kind of a crisis. Then second, there have to be clear expectations. Expectations have to be really clear. If we circle around to trust, trust is primarily an output. That is, we trust people not after they've done things. You don't trust people first, you trust people after they've proven they're worthy of trust, right? In fact, you hinted at it right at the beginning, where you said, yeah, we trust people because we've hired the right people in the first place.
Right. But if you don't, then we have not hired them. Correct.
Yeah, you don't trust random people that are walking down the street.
Correct.
You do a thorough screening program, and therefore you trust them.
Yes.
Okay, so you have to have clear So if you go back to Steve Jobs trusted his employees, but he had extremely high and clear expectations. And not only did he trust his workforce, but his workforce trusted him because they know he was going to be absolutely consistent in his expectations. They may not like it because he was very, very aggressive with his expectations. But he said, is Jobs an equal opportunity employer? Yes, he treats us all like dogs. So the point is, he was absolutely consistent with these high expectations.
Right.
And so the issue is, in the midst of this kind of chaos, there still needs to be high performance expectations. And those need to be, I think those need to be cleared. And third, then, people need to be held accountable for those results, for those accountability, for those expectations. And it's not just for their output results, but also for the behaviors they're existing. For example, have they learned how to communicate clearly and well virtually? That's a different communication skill that we'd have when we're face to face. So number one is stability. Number two is have high expectations. Number three is to have clear accountabilities. And I think the fourth is the most important. And that kind of goes back to a little bit of the stability. In the midst of chaos, then the leaders have to convey and reinforce the purpose of the organization in the first place. They have to infuse a sense of purpose that gives meaning and stability to the workforce. They need to remember this company, now this company used to be in a building. Now this company is scattered over thousands of homes around the world.
Right.
We need to remember what unites us is not the bureaucratic infrastructure that has united us for many years. What unites us now is a culture of common purpose. And we need to, and leaders have to maybe focus on a residual powerful purpose more under these conditions than they ever have before.
Right.
They may triple or quadruple the amount of time and effort they spend infusing meaning and purpose into the workforce. And by the way, that comes back to empathy, compassion, meaning, and mental health within the organization.
All right, great. Before we really open up for the audience to really ask some questions to you directly or through the Q&A tab, so audience, you can just put in your questions if you have, or you can just raise your hand. There's a tab in Zoom link for the questions. Before that, I've got this last bit of questions there. So now I've talked the number of days where COVID has really affected us is around 100, and number 100 is not a big number to really gather a lot of research, a lot of surveys, as you have also mentioned earlier. So I'm not going to ask you what is the right way of leadership in this coming time. I'm just going to ask you what are the don'ts of leadership as a construct which the leader should really not do in terms of going forward. Because the do's are something which would come with time, but I am more concerned about don'ts, because what happens is that such scenarios are once in a lifetime thing, and you are bound to make mistakes more compared to the good which you intend to do. So what leaders should really do in order to make sure that he's not making any mistakes? So I just want to understand the don'ts of leadership in these times.
That's a very good question. It's a difficult question, but it's a good question. I like this question. Number one is, I think one don't is, don't treat all your people equally. Now that sounds a little bit counterintuitive based on everything we've been talking about.
Right.
But under these conditions, leaders need to understand who it is that creates the greatest value in your company. And those people need to be amplified and focused on, and people that leaders. Every company has people has employees who are more interested in staying safe, in maybe creating bureaucracies, in not performing, not working hard, not being creative, not being innovative, not putting in extra hours. Every company has those. And the danger is if you treat the high performers the same way, you treat the low performers the same way you treat the high performers, you're going to undermine the motivation, purpose, and enthusiasm of the high performers. So under these conditions of change, they need to be more acutely aware of who the key value creators are, and to emphasize them in your communications and making sure they're confident and whatnot, and feel safe and secure. So that's one don't, and again, it's counterintuitive. Don't treat everybody equally. Otherwise, you're going to undermine the ability of the firm over the long run to perform. The second don't is to rely on rules, processes, and policies to guide your company through these troublesome times. Again, some leaders. We did some research with a doctoral student several years ago, where we looked at the relationship between financial performance and cultural intensity. And what we found is when firms had no cultural intensity, that everybody could think and behave everybody any way they wanted to, the financial performance was really low. Then as the organization would integrate and work together, then financial performance went up. But then the question was a fascinating question. And I'll ask you this, and we don't have enough time for me to cross-examine you, maybe embarrass you in front of your colleagues, so I won't do that. So the question is, what happens when culture unity becomes extreme? That is when everybody starts to think and behave the same way.
Right. A lot of
that's cultural unity, right? That's culture is how people think and behave.
Yeah.
So when everybody thinks and behaves the same way, is that going to amplify performance, or is it going to detract from performance? Interesting question. We didn't know the reason. We didn't know the answer to that question. There are theories that explain both. And what we found was the performance line split. Those companies where there is a unified and clearly cooperative consensus that we're working together to meet market requirements, guess what? Their performance went up.
Yeah.
If there's a consolidated, unified focus on the customer and beating the competition, those companies won. Those companies that focused internally on rules, procedures, processes, as they became more focused on rules, procedures, and processes, their performance dropped. So in the midst of change, leaders need to be careful not to rely upon rules, processes, and procedures to unify the organization and give it momentum and direction. That is, we need to reemphasize the importance of market awareness, keeping ourselves in touch with customers, and keeping the organization and the culture customer-centric.
Great.
So that's the second don't, is don't fall back and rely upon rules, procedures, process, and bureaucracy in the midst of these kind of changes. And some executives will have a tendency to do that. That's why I raised that issue.
Correct.
Those make sense?
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So I will just open it to audience. So we have got Arpita. Arpita, I'm just putting you on the podium. You can directly ask the question. So let's just. Arpita, you're on the podium. You can ask the question to Wayne directly.
Hello, sir.
Peter.
Is there any age groups for a leader? Who can be the best leader?
Who will be the best leader? The best leader will be the one, I think, that will do all the things we've been talking about today and don't do the things we just talked about.
Okay.
I don't think that has anything I don't think it has anything to do with ethnicity. I don't think it has anything to do with gender. I don't think it has to do with social class and status. I think the things we just talked about can be done by men, it can be done by women, it can be done by different people, different sexual orientation. It can be done in a lot of anybody follow these guidelines, I think will be successful.
Sure. Okay. So, Wayne, there is another question which is there in the Q&A tab, that how should employees deal with layoffs in the current scenario? And there's not a leadership question, but someone has really asked this.
Well, that's really a telling question. Now, this is a U.S. sample, so I know that's not going to be the same as in India. But in the United States, more than half of the CEOs in the Fortune 500 companies said that they do not expect staffing levels to ever get back to what they were at the beginning of this year. So that's I was almost startled by those statistics. And the reason is that they're finding that this virtual world makes the workforce more efficient. So they can get the value-added work done with fewer people. So the question is, so I think that's going to be a reality. Work will be done more efficiently, and there'll be need for fewer people. So how does society going to deal with that? Well, first of all, how are individuals going to deal with it? One is they'll have to learn how to deal with this new world of technology. When they go into job interviews, they must be able to talk the world of they have to be able to talk the world of technology. They must be able to convince employers that they have the ability to work virtually. So I think, over half the CEOs not only said that they won't go back to the same staffing levels, but they believe that part of the reason for that is that there'll be much more working at home instead of working back in the office. So they'll have to educate themselves technically. Second, they'll have to become more agile in their own careers. They'll have to be able to say what are the trends that are going on in the marketplace, in the world, what are the trends, and they'll have to skill themselves up to meet those needs. And finally, as you might guess, if you'll notice I'm repeating my very first principles, was they'll have to understand how to live and succeed and prosper in a world of high-tech technology, where information is the raw material that companies will use to create competitive advantage. And by the way, we know that already, at least the United States. Excuse me. I look at the growth in Infosys and Tata Consulting Services and other IT consulting firms. Their growth pattern over the last decade has been astonishing. And the same thing's happening in the United States. The number of open jobs in the United States in the high-tech sector are staggering. But that's going to require a new set of skills and knowledge for people to fit into that new world. But the point is, the opportunities are there, but people that used to build cars with their hands are going to have to build information infrastructures that give insights that we didn't know before, that they didn't know before, and their companies didn't know before.
Okay. So Wayne, I have got Nama he wants to come to the podium. Nama, you're online. You can ask him directly.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, you can ask. Yeah, you're audible.
Yes, good evening, sir. Thank you very much for having this type of session via this Zoom. That in this due to the in this pandemic situation, the leaders also to be motivated themselves. So, what are the advice you are giving for the leaders, those who are motivating others? But we as a leader, we are running the business or we are running the team. What are the motivation we have to get ourselves? What are the tools we can use, sir?
That's a great question. Your question, I believe maybe one of the two or three greatest, certainly the greatest business thinker of the last 20 or 30 years, and one of the top two or three of the last century was my colleague, C.K. Prahalad. CK used to love to tell the story that you probably heard of the two men walking through the forest, and a bear starts to chase them, and one of them sits down on a log and starts to put on his running shoes, and the other one says, "You have to run, or the bear's going to catch us and eat us." He says, "No, I don't need to outrun the bear. I just need to outrun you." So that's one of the things that leaders that will motivate leaders is we live in a world of hyper competition. You know, we've seen that in every sector in India. The level of competition just keeps getting higher and higher, and so the issue is how do you as a leader keep yourself in touch with reality? Bezos, you know, the founder of Amazon, said the most critical resource that a company has is its attention. That is what it pays attention to. And so the starting point to keep a leader motivated is to make sure your attention is focused on the right issues in the marketplace, so you not only know what the marketplace requires, but so that you also can seek opportunities to meet customer needs before the customer knows those needs exist. And that's what Amazon has done better than any company in the world so far that we know of, except for Steve Jobs inventing the iPhone. So I think that's one. And then second, there needs to be a continual upgrading of technical know-how. Third, and if I could add one other, I had great admiration for Steve Jobs. Too frequently, there's currently a big debate in the HR literature between whether a good leader is an individual contributor or whether she's an institution builder. And clearly, Steve Jobs is a pretty smart guy. But Wozniak was his technical leader. Steve's job was to build the organization, was to build the institution. And the same thing's true for Bill Gates, same thing's true for Peter Thiel, same thing's true, and the list goes on and on. And so the issue is to think about how once you understand the reality of the marketplace, then how do you create an organization with individuals that are high potential, very smart, very capable, so that your job as a leader is to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. So those are the two key steps: to understand what the marketplace requires and to create the organization capabilities that enable you to meet the requirements of those marketplace requirements better than anybody else in the world. And those are the two building blocks of successful leadership. That's a great question, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your explanation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nama. Thank you. All right. Wayne, there's another question which is there. This is not exactly leadership question, but I thought you might add some value to this. Now, Nitya is asking that if an organization is growing backwards, so the products are not getting sold, and it's all due to COVID-19. Apart from layoffs and salary cuts, is there any third way to really go about it? Of still keeping the employees with yourself and hoping that something will improve tomorrow. So how should leader really adapt to this situation?
If we were in a classroom, I would open that up for a class discussion. It's not because I don't have opinions, but I think there's lots of opinions. I don't think there's any worth of truth on that. That's a great question. Obviously, every company is almost every company except for Amazon, and maybe anyway, few are having difficulties. And so the challenge is to be able to know how you're doing relative to your competitors. Obviously, very few companies are having the same volume of sales now that they had 6 months ago, and that's going to be a reality into the foreseeable future. So the question is, and some companies are holding on to all their employees, but some will find that they're going to have to lay some off or they'll go bankrupt. I think that's just the reality of the current situation. So one of the key issues then is, what criteria do you use to determine who's going to stay and who's going to leave? And that's a very, very difficult question. If your company has enough backlog of profitability and profits in the bank to be able to sustain the entire workforce through this period of time, that's fine. And I think that should be a high priority. But if the company simply doesn't have the money, it has its credit limit at the local banks to the extent possible, then the only option for to help the other 90% to keep their jobs over the long run, you may have to eliminate 10% of the workforce and accrue the cost savings that those 10% represent. I hate to say that, but that's the reality. The obligation is to the 90%, not to the 10%. For the 10% that you might not be able to keep, you better make sure that those are the low performing people in low value added jobs. That becomes the two criteria. Those become the two criteria for who might potentially leave. Low performing people in low value added positions. And then I think you have a moral obligation as much as possible to help them find work, to help them upskill, and to provide a buffer as they leave so that their families don't starve, even while they won't get being paid as much money. Clearly those families will have to adjust their lifestyle, and that's happening around the world. That CEO survey, and this is in the United States, half the CEOs in the U.S. say that they've had to cut salaries during this time period, in addition to laying people off. So that's, I think, a reality, and leaders are going to have to step up. And as painful as that is, that'll have to happen in some companies.
So when there's another question now, there's it sounds very simple, but I'm not so sure if the answer is going to be that simple. Maithili has asked that how should the people leader, or any leader for that matter, keep the employees happy in these such a testing times of sadness and challenges around us? How can we still stay happy and motivated? What should leaders really do in these times?
By the way, thank you for that question. That's a brilliant question. For years and years, in organizations, especially in HR, there was kind of a happiness paradigm. That somehow, if we've got people to be happy, they'll be performing, right? If we could create a happy workforce, we'll have a high-performing workforce. And that's just empirically, I hate to say it, there's not much research that supports that. In fact, there's research to the opposite. And it's a simple logic. You have two groups of people you can have happy. You can have high-performing, ingenious, aggressive, sales-oriented, innovative, hard-working, high-performance individuals. And you want them to be happy, right? You want them to be happy. But then you've got another group of people who might be happy, who are happy that they haven't been found out, that they don't work hard, they don't perform, but nobody's discovered them. And they're happy because they haven't been discovered, that they're not providing any value. So who do you want to have be happy? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. But when we talk about, the problem is that sometimes when we impose the happiness paradigm and logic on the whole organization, that's irrelevant. Because you've got every company, as we talked about earlier, has some people that you don't want to be happy. You want them to, if they're not performing, you don't want them to be happy. I'm a non-performer, but I'm happy being a non-performer. That's a stupid statement, right? So we need to be careful putting this happiness overlay onto everyone.
Yeah.
If somebody is a low performer, you need to give them a chance to improve. But if you can't help them to be happy, meeting the requirements of the shareholders and the customer, then the company doesn't exist to make non-performers happy. The company exists to meet the requirements of the purpose of society. So that's one perspective on happiness. The other one is, and the second perspective is relevant, especially for today's COVID world, is the research that the paradigm we used to believe is that happy people are productive people. Okay. The more recent research on productivity says it's not that happy people are productive, but that productive people become happy.
Correct.
Okay, so the lever is not happiness, the lever is productivity, empowerment, and self-fulfillment. It's not, happiness will be the outcome of helping people to be high-performing and know they're high-performing, and they're high-performing because they're doing it, and they'll feel fulfilled, they'll feel meaning and purpose in their lives, and that one will make them happy as they go home every day.
Great. Those are great insights. Right. So I think we have about 5-10 more minutes. I think we can take up one more question if that is okay with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm happy. I've got a few more minutes.
Sure. Okay. So there's another question which is there is so we have an anonymous person who is there. So I'm just framing this question. So we always talked about the difference between a manager and a leader. That has been a generation-long discussion which is going on. Now, in today's time, where is the overlap which is happening? For example, that for an existing manager, so what are the first steps he should be taking in terms of becoming a leader? Because the times are not the same, and on-the-job learning might not be the best solution to really go about managing and themselves and becoming a leader. So what is your thought on becoming a manager leader in these times?
Whoever anonymous is, that's a great question. I've been teaching that distinction between leadership and manager for 20 years, and nobody's actually asked the question, so how do you make the transition from being a manager to being a leader? So let me suggest 4 steps. One is, managers tend to be internally focused, leaders tend to be externally focused. Leaders tend to be results driven, managers tend to be process oriented. They manage processes, leaders manage results. Managers seek to control. That's one of the pillars of management. Leaders tend to empower. And they empower through a whole variety of means: delegating authority, delegating purpose, delegating information, delegating accountability. The last transition is leaders infuse purpose. Managers simply don't care about purpose. They're interested only in profits and money, whereas leaders infuse purpose. So those are if you're a manager, you want to become a leader, that's your checklist to make transitions on each one of those 4 dimensions. That's a great question. I wish you hadn't been anonymous. I'd like to congratulate you for a great question.
So that's one of the last questions is there. I think we're running out of time. So Shri has asked about this thing that you have mentioned about the high-performing employees who are there in your organization. You need to make them stay in the system. But her question is that how should we really make the employees high-performing in these times? And what are the things which a leader should do in these times to improve and enhance the productivity?
Oh, that's a great question. In these times, people need to set their goal. First of all, I don't think there's any magic answer to this. I think leaders, whether it's face-to-face, it won't be face-to-face right now, but it'll be virtual meetings face-to-face. Still need to negotiate goals and accountabilities, responsibilities with each employee. And then they need to meet regularly with their employees as individuals and with teams to make sure that these accountability expectations are that each employee is making progress in accomplishing their. Are we still on, by the way?
I'm right here.
Okay, sorry. I mean, you're a good-looking guy, but that triangle wasn't as pretty as you are. So anyway, remind me of the question that threw me off a little bit. Say the question again.
Yeah. So the person she is asking about keeping the employees. How should we make the employees' productivity level at high? Like what is the index? So she's asking about that in these times.
So it's still a matter of setting goals, but now instead of process goals, they become output goals. There might still be some behavioral elements to their goals, but there'll be a greater focus on output. Second, there'll be if you think about, there's two dimensions for assessing behavior, or assessing performance. One is you can assess output, and you can assess behavior. So some jobs you can assess output, but you can't assess behavior. A salesperson, you can't rely upon behavior to know if a person's selling well. What you do is the sales manager at the end of the week says, "What have you sold?" On the other hand, there's some jobs that are difficult to measure behavior, but it's difficult to measure output, but it's easy to measure behavior. For example, a airline stewardess in an airline, she doesn't fill out a survey at the end of the flight and ask every employee, was Mary friendly? Now, what happens is her supervisor stands in the back of the plane and says, "Is Mary smiling? Is she responding quickly to customers? Is she efficient? Is she solving the passengers' problems before they exist?" So some jobs are oriented towards output measurements, others are oriented towards behavior measurements. Now, the interesting thing in the COVID situation, output is more problematic because we're in the middle of a time where customers aren't buying as much. At the same time, you can't watch what your employees are doing, so it becomes more difficult to look at their behavior. So how do you assess whether people are performing? That's a great question. Well, now this puts the burden right back onto the shoulders of HR. Did they hire the right people in the first place? So that under these, and that's what you mentioned at the very first of this meeting. If you've hired the right people in the first place, then you can trust that they'll be working hard to achieve their outputs, and they'll be working hard and exhibiting the right behaviors, even though you can't watch them. So the question is, has HR and the leaders hired the right people in the first place? That's the way you do it.
Okay. All right. So I think we have really come to end of time. I think time is running short. To all the audience, people who are asking for the feedback form, it will be sent directly to your email ID. You can give your feedbacks there, and then I will also share it with Wayne at the same time. Wayne, before we end the session, I have a couple of more things. So first is any last bit of advice you want to give to all the leaders out here, and since this would be in public domain, so people would love to hear something which probably we have not covered. I think this has been a very exhaustive discussion, and it is so insightful. It's a lot of weight in my head right now. I do just process a lot of information which you have given. So, any last bit you'd like to add?
Yes, I had two final comments. One is that, as I indicate, I don't think not everybody was online when I mentioned this, but my next trip to India will be my number 127th trip to India.
Okay.
So I've spent a lot of my career in India. In fact, my wife sometimes tells me, I sometimes say that India is my second home, and my wife will say, no, it's really your first home. So I've spent a lot of time in India, and it's been one of the greatest blessings of my life, because there's a spiritual element to how people are treated in India that I don't think exists anywhere else in the world. And that's why much of my orientation towards organization, towards HR strategy and leadership, at least seems to have such deep resonance in India. So as a result, we've got data that HR practices in India, the right HR practices in India, have greater influence on business performance than in any other country. I mean, we've got empirical evidence that shows that. So I'm very optimistic about the future of India. The world will get through COVID, but India has built on a spiritual, I don't want to overdo it, but a spiritual commitment to itself, to its society, to its country, and to its people that seldom exists anywhere else in the world. So I am very optimistic about the future of your country, and I hope you share that confidence going forward and build on it as we go through COVID-19 and build India to an even more powerful and successful country and society. So I wish you all the very best. Good luck and Godspeed.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. If I got just one last thing, which is about leadership as a brand. If you don't mind, can I ask you this thing? This is my personal question. This is not a audience question. This is my personal question, which I normally do at the very end of the webinar. Okay, so branding is something which is very critical, whether it's a product, whether it's a company, whether it's an individual. You take anything, branding is so critical. So lead and today's time, if I'm firing someone or if I'm laying off someone from, let's say, from my startup, suddenly from someone who would like me will start hating me, and that's a very normal behavior, right? People, it's hard by to come to understand that in such difficult times you're laying off and things like that. So I have got this concept, which is just a random theory, which is something called a leadership personal branding. Okay, so you are a leader. How is that your perception you have to build? What are the components which you should be filling in to make sure that your perception and your approach to leadership as a concept, as a leader, is positive, even if you're firing? So we have seen a lot of letters and a lot of ways which organizations have fired, right? So we have got people in Uber who have fired right on Zoom call, and then we have got someone from Grab, the CEO of Grab and CEO of Airbnb writing these heartfelt letters to their employees, and suddenly there's this huge paradigm difference in terms of leader as a brand. You, like, as an individual, as a leader, as a brand. So what is that thing which is about building that perception about leaders? I just want some insight, if you can throw on that. It's just a personal thing which I want to understand.
Okay, so let me give you just a couple of quick thoughts, because we're going to run out of time.
Yeah.
First of all, brand is a perception. Okay, brand is what other people attribute to you. It's not what you have, it's what other people attribute to you. But the brand is based upon reality. Perceptions are created by people observing certain things. And based upon that, they start to generalize what they see into an overall brand. For example, if they see somebody smiling all the time, trying to help other people, they see them answering questions, they see them providing assistance to their families, then that aggregation of behaviors, people will say, oh, that's a friendly leader. So friendly becomes a brand perception of that people based upon people observing an aggregation of behaviors. Okay? So the key issue is for leaders to have a brand is they have to behave certain ways and exhibit those behaviors publicly and consistently. And in order for that brand to be legitimate and credible, those behaviors have to result in performance. So that combination of performance and behaviors that are consistently done result in people using certain words to describe that leader, and those words that they use to describe that leader and their behaviors and the results that are created by those behaviors become that person's brand. You can't always control your output, but you can always control your behavior. So the foundation is the behavior. And the reason I say that is there other factors that impact output besides your behavior? Luck, skill, somebody else's failure. So the foundation is your behavior that over time do create results. And that results in brand. The danger is in framing it too much in terms of brand. If you talk a brand, but your behaviors don't support that brand, then you lose your credibility and your legitimacy to lead very quickly. So talking brand, to me, is almost 100% irrelevant. What creates the brand is your behaviors that create results.
Great. I mean, there's been a lot of information which you have to process, and I'm sure there were a lot of people who would like to see this video. And so on that note, Wayne, I'm so glad that you accepted the invitation, and we've finally been able to pull this thing off. So happy you could make some time, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming.
For having me, and good luck and best to all of you.
Thank you. This is Namaste from India, and you hope we have a good day ahead. Yeah. Okay.
I look forward to the day where we all meet in person.
Absolutely. I'm waiting for your 127th trip to India. And I will. Thank you all the audience.